I'm here. No, I'm home. Uh,
Okay,
we get tomorrow off. That's
Okay.
it.
okay,
The rest of the Fridays, we're in session.
okay.
You were right, Duran. It's not as much fun.
No, not as much.
Ooh-wee.
Professor Jones, did I see on Facebook you met somebody really famous recently?
Yes, you see that
Yes.
I have her as my my profile picture. Sorry,
I
lost
saw
words for a
that. I
second.
said, well, boy, I'm in the wrong circles.
Who did you meet? Who is
Cardi
this?
B. Cardi
You
B.
met Cardi B.
She was being honored by the Neighborhood Defender Service at their, I think, 30-year gala.
Wow.
And so I had the opportunity to go to the gala.
Oh,
She was
fun.
very, very
Okay.
gracious. She took pictures with all sorts of folk who were there.
Well, next time, maybe you can bring me and Dr. Davis along. We'd like to.
Yeah.
Hello,
Yeah.
Ms. Days. How are you?
Good evening and Hotep, everyone. I am well, and I hope everyone is doing well this evening. And happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Well, it is 6:32, and we are going to go ahead and get started. First, I want to welcome each of our panelists for being here, and I want to welcome our attendees who are on with us as well. This is our second of a series as we're talking about critical race theory for the NAACP and our Political Action Committee, and our chairwoman is here on the call with us. Sandy Giles is here with us. And so I wanted to see if our vice president is with us here from the NAACP to bring greetings. I'm not sure if he is on. It does not look like he is. So on behalf of the NAACP, I will welcome each of our panelists and welcome the attendees for coming here on a very cold Thursday night. And so hopefully you are someplace warm. And this will be a very riveting and exciting discussion. I'm hoping that we won't be here more than an hour. And so we had such a good discussion in our part one series of this for critical race theory that some folks wanted to have a part two series and bring folks back and have a part two series here. And so I'm just very grateful. I know everybody has a busy schedule and that you have stuck around to be part of this raring crowd for a second go around. So if we can just do quick introductions before we get started. First, we will start with State Representative Ingrid Burnett.
Oh, thank you. Hi. I'm State Rep Ingrid Burnett. I represent District 19, which is part of the Urban Core of Kansas City over in historic Northeast, and moves then east along the river into Sugar Creek and Independence. I serve on the Budget Committee. I serve on the Education Appropriations Committee. I sit on the Joint Committee on Education. And I sit on what is now called the Legislative Review Committee, which I'm not quite sure what the purpose of that committee is, other than to maybe be a proxy for conference committees as bills acquire amendments. But that's my role in the State House. Thanks.
Thank you for being here, Ingrid. We'll go with you, Dr. Davis.
Hello and good evening, everyone. And again, thank you for having me back for part two. My name is Daryl Davis. I serve as the Assistant Superintendent of Equity, Inclusion, and Innovation for Kansas City Public Schools. And so happy to be here. Thank you again.
Ms. Daisy.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sandra Days, and I'm a fourth grade teacher with the Kansas City Public School System at the African Center College Prep Academy, known as ACE Prep, where we teach African and African American history throughout the school year. I'm very pleased and honored to be back with you all on this evening.
Thank you so much. And Professor Jones.
Hi, I'm Jamila Jefferson Jones. I am a professor of law at Wayne State University. I was formerly at University of Missouri, Kansas City. I teach in the areas of property and fair housing. I also write in those areas. I also write about the racialization of space um, and issues with regard to equity in housing. I am the Associate Director for Property Equity and Justice at the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights, also at Wayne State. I'm happy to be with you all for this second time together.
And I'm Deron McGee. I'm your moderator for this evening on this discussion. I formerly served with Representative Burnett in the State House. I was a state representative representing South Kansas City, and I currently am vice president of the Hickman Middle School Board. So, but let's jump right into it. We have a lot to discuss, and so I'm looking at the chat here, and I just want to briefly, like, you know, when you go through when you watch a TV show, they give you the preview of what happened last time, right? So people are asking us if they missed the first part of this riveting series, how can they access it? It was online I believe it was on a YouTube channel that the NAACP did post, and so that we can make that, if Sandy, you can put in the chat how to make that available to people, that will be helpful for the questions that are already in the chat. But I will try to do a brief recap. And Professor Jones, if you can just give a brief recap of what we, as we talk about from the legal construct, what is critical race theory and what is its impact in terms of the legal education as it goes. So I'll throw that to you.
Sure. As we mentioned in the first part of the series, critical race theory, although people are up in arms about it at school board meetings and the like, it is not generally taught on the elementary or secondary level. Though we do know that one of our school districts, and I'll let Dr. Davis get to this, did in their response to the state say, yes, we do teach some critical race theory. I would surmise that they just get into a little tip of it. But what critical race theory is a lens for looking at laws, looking at legal systems, and of course, doing so with a truthful historical context. And I'm sure that that is what's taught at AC Prep and what Dr. Davis and his cohort have been teaching the children in Kansas City public schools. And hopefully, Mr. McGee, that's what's being taught in Hickman Mills also, is the truth about history. But critical race theory was born in law schools. One of the grandfather or the father of that movement is the late Professor Derek Bell. And basically it was a spinoff or a branch out of critical legal theory, which instead of just taking law as this neutral proposition and saying, oh, the law is neutral and it just works naturally and it's just following these natural precepts, these folks said, wait, there's more going on here. There are systems in place that perpetuate privilege, and in the case of race, do so on a racialized basis. And so that is what critical race theory is. It is taught in law schools. The first time, and I told you all last time, I'm from a city that when I was growing up was majority African-American. There were African-Americans in charge of the school board, and our superintendents were African-American, a number of my teachers were. I didn't learn about critical race theory, though I did have a good grounding in history and in US history and in African-American history. But critical race theory is something that is taught on a graduate school level, primarily in law schools, and then it has expanded some in schools of education and in other graduate programs. But it is a lens that helps us to lift off the covers of this idea of neutrality and meritocracy and to look beyond it and see the systems that are perpetuated and the power structures that are perpetuated through these systems.
Thank you, Professor Jones. And Ingrid, if you can sort of recap from a state perspective, what legislation happened last session with regard to critical race theory. You can kind of keep it brief. Go ahead.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I want to just say thank you for including me as part of this discussion. It's certainly, I don't consider myself an expert or someone who you would come to on this topic. I have explored it for my own personal reasons, but because I'm curious about why it has become such a hot topic for my colleagues in the House. And I think it started with the 1619 project, which I listened to, and I don't know, I found it just really enlightening and interesting and motivating, inspiring to take a look at how I live my life and how I perceive the people in my community. And I live in a very diverse community, as you know, Duran. I brag a lot about representing the most diverse district in the state, and I do. It's not just in terms of culture or race or ethnicity, but also in ideologic, religion, professional status, education status, housing status, however you want to slice it. This district has it all. In the House last year, I think was the first year that we really saw this kind of come up, and it was a reaction to the 1619 project. And so the legislation that was proposed was really directed at that. It didn't seem to get much traction. This year, over the interim, I sit on the Joint Committee on Education, and we had 3 different hearings that all wanted to deal in some way, fashion, form, or other on critical race theory. The first one was very anti-CRT. The second one allowed for people to come in and provide an alternative opinion and discussion. And then the third one was back to why we should not be teaching CRT. What I want to preface all of this conversation with, though, is that there's really a misinformation out there around what critical race theory is when we're talking about how it gets translated into the curriculum for kindergarten K through 12 education, right? And so what there's this kind of transformation to anything having to do with equity, diversity, or inclusion is being labeled as CRT, which is, I don't know how we can teach history or how we can teach the kinds of things that we when we talk about character education without including diversity, equity, and inclusion. But there it is. There's this real resistance and pushback to teaching anything that would make students feel uncomfortable. I'm going to move over to this year because now that it has gained this kind of traction, I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of legislation for this year. In the Senate, we've got 46 bills.
Ingrid, I'm going to stop you before you get into that because that's part of another topic we're going to jump into. So just hold that thought.
All right.
It actually leads us into a much different discussion. I want to take it. So just wanted to give the folks who are tuning in, we've got about 45 people on the Zoom tonight. just sort of give them an opportunity to sort of hear where we were and bring them up to speed. So the way I want to take the conversation tonight, since we last talked, we've had a few elections around the country. And critical race theory was a large part of a lot of those races. If you notice your elections, even locally, in Johnson County, in Shawnee Mission, in Olathe, you had candidates that were running on this issue of fighting critical race theory en masse, but mainly critical race theory in their public education system. And there was big money pumped into these schools, particularly on the Kansas side in Johnson County. You had money from these Koch brothers, Walmart, these types that were using this as a wedge issue. And then on the eastern side of the country, now Governor Youngkin in Virginia, who beat Terry McAuliffe, who basically made the issue of critical race theory they shifted it. It was originally about critical race theory, but they shifted the argument about parents being involved in their kids' education. And somehow that if critical race theory is in the schools, that somehow white people are bad and that you should be involved in your kids' education. And this conversation has gone way beyond what critical race theory is actually about. And so I really want to focus a conversation tonight about how this is being used and weaponized in elections and in legislation across the country. And so I want to point this now to Dr. Davis. Are you seeing some of this from the state level, like in terms from DESE, from state legislators? And then I'll bring Ms. Days in the conversation next. So Dr. Davis, what are you seeing from an administrative level from what we're seeing around the country and locally here in some of these school board elections?
Yes, great question. And I've been watching a little bit nationally, a lot of school board races and other races that where critical race theory was at the center, and it really was the wedge issue that swung the election toward certain candidates. For us in Kansas City Public Schools, we are aware that there was a bill introduced in Missouri. I know that bill initially died, and I'm sure it will come back, but other bills, say in Texas or Tennessee, that have passed, bills banning critical race theory and the teaching of certain aspects of history, I'm sure that will come back around in Missouri. But for us, we have not personally seen or experienced the backlash here in this particular ecosystem. And as shared on our last call, our employees all engage in implicit bias training. Our directors, our principals engage, and cabinet level staff engage in other equity focused trainings throughout our year. And we're looking for more. We're looking for time to engage more fully. I have 4 schools that have requested trainings over the next 4 Wednesdays. So the need here is evident. Our staff, our families, our students want to engage in these discussions. And so we've been fortunate not to feel that particular backlash in our community.
Ms. Days, and I know you're in the classroom, and so are you seeing from your perspective, I know you're in a unique situation because you teach in an African-centered school. So your situation is different. Have you seen any pushback to just the overall thought of having an African-centered school in the community? Because some folks think that too may be problematic, right? So do you see from a national perspective or a local perspective, any pushback or any resistance to having the type of school that you teach in?
Well, we are a signature school. We have not received any pushback from our parents because our parents elect to have their children to attend AC Prep. So they want their children to have an African-centered education. what I'm seeing in our community and across the country is CRT being used as a weapon in education for children that are in grades K through 12. We do not teach law school, but what we do teach at AC Prep is the social, economic, psychological effects of racism, discrimination, prejudice that have occurred throughout history and how that has impacted African people and African American people and other people of color throughout the entire history of the world. And I do not see anything wrong in teaching that. And I do have our themes, and I'll be happy to share our themes from August to May, what we teach here at AC Prep. And there's nothing that we teach that anyone should see as correct. And when somebody mentioned not hurting children's feelings, when you do not teach equity and inclusion and diversity in your school system, you are jeopardizing those children's education. And you're giving them a mindset that is very narrow when we should not be doing that, because we want our children to have a broad band of learning. We want them to be multifaceted, and we want them to experience the world from many different lenses, not just one. And so this is very important for me and the staff here at AC Prep. And we don't know what tomorrow will bring. This might be my last school year where I have been allowed in the state of Missouri to teach what I'm teaching. And so we are holding this year as a very bittersweet year here at AC Prep, because there is a great possibility I will not be allowed to do what I love to do, which is much needed, not only here, but across the country.
Thank you, Ms. Days. Professor Jones, you talked in the last discussion about you have been working with other groups to really inform people and help sort of fight this narrative. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you're doing and other groups you're working with to sort of fight this narrative that's happening across the country?
Sure, it's not so much groups that have formed in a formal sense. Actually, right now, the Association of American Law Schools is having its annual meeting. And there are those of us who are on various panels talking about the future of CRT and taking back the narrative of what CRT is, because it has been twisted by the right for political reasons. As Representative Burnett mentioned, I believe, you have people who are trying to equate CRT with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think Dr. Davis also talked about that. And those initiatives are different. Those initiatives are about making sure that all of the members of an educational community, for example, are heard and are at the table, that they get to help to build the table, that they decide what's served on the table, all of those sorts of things. So from my own personal perspective, one of the things I'm doing, I'm speaking next week. I was asked by a rural municipality, actually by their library system in rural Michigan, to come in and tell them what CRT is. I'm pleased that this community, which is, as I asked the lady who invited me, she says it's very much 90% white community, but they want to learn because they have figured out that they're not being told the whole story. So they want someone to tell them what is the story, someone who's not a politician, someone who just wants to educate them and give them the information. One of the things that I mentioned last time is that we have lost sight of what critical means. Critical means to critique, to look at it closely, to examine, to not take for granted. And I think what the right has done is said critical means to critique me, to criticize me. And so they're using this to say, well, this, like we said, is going to hurt the feelings of white children. Of course, there's no regard for the feelings of children of color in that conversation. It only centers white children, and really not even white children, white parents, because I don't think the children are bothered by learning the truth. So what you have are those who are critical race theorists, like myself, and others who've been working in the trenches in this much longer than have I, are basically out there retaking the narrative and educating people in various ways. So not formalized groups. We already exist out there, but we were doing our work in law schools, and they decided to poke at us, and which sends us out into the rest of the world to explain it to others, because before I would not have been tapped by the local public library in rural Michigan. Well, now I have been. And so I get to go and spread this information to people who otherwise wouldn't have known anything about it. So I think in some ways, what will eventually happen, or what is in process, is a kind of a backfiring of their mission, because you have excited people who before were fairly happy in our ivory towers talking to each other. So now we're talking to everyone. So that's really what's going on out in the world, I believe.
I would say though, too, I mean, to add what you're saying, I think Representative Burnett made a good point. I think most of the country had no idea what CRT was until the 1619 Project. I mean, that really put this on the forefront for a lot of people, and for white people, right, in a threatening sort of way. If you have not listened to the 1619 podcast, I really would encourage you to do that. It is about 10 episodes. They're about an hour apiece, but they are very interesting because it talks about race in various functions of American society, discrimination amongst Black farmers. I mean, I'm not a farmer, but it gives you a lot of insight to how banks loan money and just all of that. And so it's really, if you have not listened to that, I would encourage you to do that. For our attendees who are listening to this webinar today, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will bring them up as we have time to the panelists. So please feel free to put them in the chat. Ingrid, now you were going to talk about the legislation. Can you talk about the legislation that's been filed in Missouri, here in our capital, Jefferson City?
I can a little bit. Yes. So in the Senate, there have been 46 education bills so far filed for this year. 5 of them have to do with curriculum. 3 of those 5, 4 of them all basically have language that is pretty generic, that not to promote or allow divisive concepts is the theme of those 4. One specifically sponsored by Senator Bratton in the Kansas City metropolitan area. Actually, he's over in the eastern Jackson County. He specifically mentions the 1619 Project or any successor to it, CRT or any successor. I don't think that that's one that I don't think that Senator Bratton has a lot of influence among his colleagues.
It's also important to note that Senator Bratton is running for Congress.
Yes, yeah, yeah. He's always been kind of that lightning rod, uh, and because I think he likes to be that lightning rod for hot topics. Um, I would be concerned about the ones sponsored by um, Senator Onder, for example, or Senator Koenig. They have a little more influence, and those tend to be the more generic, um, either allowing the local school boards to have control over the curriculum, or specifically prohibiting the state school board or any school board to promote or allow anything that teaches about divisive concepts. Um, because that then, excuse me, I've got a dog that wants my
So
attention.
would that mean then that they could not teach about the Civil War?
Well, it could, I suppose. Yes. And I think that will be the kind of debate that we should have, and that the opponents to this legislation should be preparing for. And
I could say that there are some states that even though they may teach the Civil War, many students think it's strictly about states' rights. And many students are surprised to know that, enslavement of African Americans was, even at the center or a part of that at all. Really, this effort to sanitize history from our schools, it robs all of our students of the truth. And we really need, I don't want to say advocates, but we need those at in the State House and the Senate to really continue to fight this, for the benefit. It benefits all students. Representative Burnett mentioned, divisive topics. Well, some would say that just talking about race is divisive when it's not. We have to have these conversations. It's impossible to discuss the history of our country without the systemic oppression of some, primarily those of color. It has to be a part of every time period. We can't talk about any period in our 400-year experiment of the United States.
I would agree. Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, I would agree, absolutely. And I think the other piece that they are using on the ultra conservative over to the ultra right side has to do with they're conflating that whole education. So when I just kind of a response to what you said, I was taught, and so I'm 68 years old this year. And when I was growing up, I remember being taught that the Civil War was about states' rights. And what a surprise that was to me, because I thought it was about slavery, but now my teachers are telling me, no, it was about states' rights. And I kind of bought that narrative until I got further down the road in my education. And I think in some ways, what we're seeing from the folks in my generation is kind of a backlash back to, no, it was about states' rights because that's what I was taught when I was a child. When actually that it really wasn't about states' rights, and we figured that out. But now they have also conflated that with the LGBTQ. So when we talk about divisive concepts, we're not just talking about racial relationships. We're also talking about what is the role, or what is our, where are we as a culture when it comes to accepting the LGBTQ community and their, does that make a family? Can they raise children? Or do we accept that as a normal kind of state for people? There's a lot. That's the part about the CRT that I find particularly concerning and alarming, is that we're conflating that with more than just racism and the role of racism in policy. We're also adding to that
Yeah, I
this
think that
whole-
politicians are really using, the folks' fear of people of
Exactly.
color, of immigrants, of LGBTQ
Exactly.
individuals to then just
Anybody different
claim
than,
power in this multi-pluralistic society that we should have. And we just, I think we should combat that from all of our perspectives, respective circles as best we can.
CRT should be, I think that's a piece of this that we need to be careful about, that when we talk about critical race theory, we are specifically talking about race. We're not talking about sexuality. We're not talking about our, our culture of origin. We are specifically talking about how race has played a role in the way that we establish policy in government.
And I want to add, when I was doing some research in leading up to this last election, critical race theory was mentioned on Fox News 2,300 times in 1 month. And to better understand how widespread these efforts are, CRT has been actually banned in 9 states. They've actually passed legislation to ban CRT in 9 states, and those states include Idaho, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Iowa, and New Hampshire, South Carolina, Arizona, and North Dakota. And in Arizona, the legislation was overturned by the state Supreme Court. So I just want to put that in context for our viewers, because I think it's really, really important to understand when Ingrid talks about the legislation that's filed in Jefferson City, this is real. I mean, they banned it already in 9 states. And so it leads me to one of the questions that someone's already asked in the chat. As you see that they're banning this in our state capitals, and obviously it was overturned by the Supreme Court in Arizona, in one of those states, someone asked, how can parents advocate for the curriculums that represent and support diversity? And I'll leave that to Dr. Davis, Professor Jones, and to Representative Burnett. I mean, how can parents do that? What is the best avenue? Is it a legal one? Obviously, is that a lawsuit? Is that going to the school board meetings? Is that dealing with your school administrator, your school teacher, Ms. Days, or going to your state legislator? I mean, you all can jump in there. What is the best avenue for parents here? And we'll start with Professor Jones, and we'll go to Ms. Days, Dr. Davis, and Representative Burnett.
So thank you, Tara, for that question. She's a friend of mine, so hey, Tara. The answer to your question, the question that you just posed, is yes. All of those things, right? So it's going to depend on the parent and what they're able to do, but you should be involved in your local school board meetings. You should check out the agenda and see what's on the agenda. And if it is something that is of interest to you, you should show up. You should go through whatever their process is to speak, if you would like to speak, or to provide written commentary, if they allow that. It all will depend on your school board and their systems, but you should follow it and you should know what's going on. If you are able to be involved in your children's school, my children are in school in Kansas, in Blue Valley, and my daughter and I are on a student parent board that meets with the principal and some of the administrators and teachers monthly. And one of the things that we do talk about, in addition to other things, we talk about pep rallies and this and that, but we talk about inclusion. And so if your school has something like that, then try to get involved in it. If they do not have that, then try to start it. Start the conversation with the administration and the teachers and other parents and students at your school. And if you are able, then you should also get involved in talking to your legislators, your school board members, and whomever else you are able to lobby. You can do that individually. It's often helpful to do it with organizations like the NAACP. I also belong to other organizations of Black women, and we go and talk about information and issues that are important to us. I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta and of the Links Incorporated, and we have our national days at our state capitals, at our local school boards, at at the US Capitol. And so if you are involved in any of those organizations, you should do it through them. Of course, we can all join the NAACP and work through this organization. There's lots of ways to get involved, but the answer is yes, get involved, and you can find the entry point that works for you, but that's the only way that you'll have a voice.
Dr. Davis?
Yes, I agree with everything that Dr. Jones shared, and I would say, as a first point is to really support the election of board members in your respective districts that are going to be true advocates for students and parents to make sure that all students achieve high outcomes. And so if true, we want parents to be involved in the local education of their students, it really starts with making sure that the right school board members are elected that then will inform policy in those districts. And so we're fortunate to have an equity-focused school board through several of our previous administrations. Our previous board chair in Melissa Robinson passing an equity board policy, continued through our previous board chair, Mansur, and our current board chair, Nate Hogan. We have truly equity-focused board members who are insisting that we have policies that benefit all. And another way that parents can advocate for their kids in the instruction is really to insist that we have courses that supplement the traditional history courses that really are leaving students of color out of the curriculum. And so we have brought back, of course, we have the AC Prep program that has done a phenomenal job over decades of educating those students to the true history of not only African Americans, but pre-colonial, pre-enslavement, going back to Africa. But in our schools today, we have brought back Black history classes, Latinx classes, and this is really because our parents demanded it. And so in any school system, parents have to use their voice through the board election process, but then also if there is a district level parent organization in the Kansas City Public Schools, we have our district advisory committee that is parent led. I encourage parents that want to be involved and to have influence over curriculum improvements to join that. And then if you're outside of Kansas City Public Schools, to seek out your district's parent-led organizations and become active in that and to influence decisions that are being made with the district administration.
And just for the folks listening in, if you have more questions, please keep them in the chat. Ms. Days, from a school perspective, what can parents do in the school building from the school building perspective?
Yes, they can be very supportive of the programs that are in their school. We need the support. And tonight's topic is fighting forward to change the narrative. And this month is January. Dr. Martin Luther King holiday is in a couple of days. During the civil rights movement, we fought to get those rights. Again, we're going to have to fight in order to get the curriculum that we need in our schools. Unfortunately, as an educator, this is what I've noticed, this is what I know. Doctors, physicians make decisions for the doctors and the operators. In the courtroom, lawyers and judges make the decision. But in education, teachers do not make the decision. Our body of legislators in Jefferson City makes the decision of what's going to be taught in our schools here in Missouri. And very few of our representatives are educators or come from an educator background. So that means we need to start voting for people who are going to fight for our cause. We need to support people that are going to fight for our behalf. So when they are elected, they can have the ability to change the narrative. But if we don't have anyone at the table representing us at the table, that narrative is not going to be changed. And if something is changed, it's not going to be for our benefit. So it's very important that we are voting. We know what these candidates are standing for and whether or not they are fighting for our causes or not. If they're a Democrat, but they're not fighting for public schools and pro-labor, they don't need your vote. But if they're a Republican and they're for the public schools here in Missouri and they're for pro-labor and they're voting to help the situation, even though they're a Republican, we might need to consider back that candidate because we have to have somebody that's going to fight for us. And that's so very important. And even during the Children's March in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, the children rose up and they fought and they let their voices be heard. And that changed, that was the catalyst that changed the way of thinking in this country. When they saw children being attacked by police dogs and sprayed with water hoses, that changed the whole mindset of the civil rights movement. So we have to fight, and we have to be not afraid to fight. We have gotten so comfortable, and we have gotten so afraid to speak up that we cannot do that. Enough is enough. Speak up, demand, fight, knock on doors, call. Eventually, somebody's going to listen. But it's so important that we have people that are on those levels of government that are going to fight for us. And you have to know what these candidates are about. You got to do your research. And it's so important. Parents, you have a voice. Community, you have a voice. Use that voice and help us with this fight.
Well, it's fun. Ms. Days, you mentioned a couple boxes there. I think it's important, as you stated, having a former teacher with that voice, and you talk about somebody who was pro-public education. And I think we have no greater friend than Representative Ingrid Burnett. So Ingrid, tell us what parents can do at the state level, because you were a teacher in KCPS. So you were on the school board.
Well, not in KCPS,
Yeah.
I was on the school.
And you were on the school board. So tell us what parents can do from a
Been a
parent's
teacher.
perspective to influence you legislators to get better legislation.
Well, can I say first that I would like to have Ms. Day's contact information so I can call her when I need to be inspired and encouraged, because I'm really encouraged by her message. And she really, I think, has spelled it out. Parents, at first, it's going to come to parents. Legislators, Duran, as you well know, are scared to pieces when parents start speaking up and making their voices heard, organizing and advocating and for legislation, because they vote. And when they make it known that they vote, legislators are concerned about that. That's who they want to support their voters. And what we're seeing now is this kind of influence from this very conservative and I really struggle with calling it a conservative movement, because I think it's just fear. And I'm not sure that it has as much to do with conservatism. And don't get me wrong, I'm probably way far, I would be way far over on the liberal side. But this is more about sowing fear and gaining power than it is really about teaching anything about the truth. So yes, I think what parents should be doing is organizing around their what they want to see for their children, organizing around their school, supporting their teachers, being involved at the local level with their school board, and advocating for the things that they want to see happen for their children. And it should not be around what parents don't want, I think. I certainly didn't as a parent. And I don't see my adult children wanting that for their children. What they don't want is censorship. What they don't want is this ban on understanding how we got to where we are today and how to move beyond where we are today to make our world a better place.
And I would say too, to something Ms. Day said, and Ingrid, you know this, from my time in Jefferson City, a lot of bad educational policy was stopped because we had Republican legislators who sided with Democrats that were pro-public education.
Right.
Because there were about, when I first got to the House, there were about maybe 15 pro-public education Republicans in the House, and 5 of them were former superintendents. And some of them were former teachers, and they were, there was this move to expand charter schools outside of just Kansas City and St. Louis. And we were able to stop that because they had these public school Republicans. And so I agree with what Ms. Days talked about, because if it had not been for those 15 Republicans, charter schools would be statewide. And it's important to know, even in one of the most conservative states in the country, in Kansas, the state of Kansas does not have charters in the state of Kansas. Hence why KCK school district is bigger than KCPS, because they don't have charters. And so I just want that to be out there for our
well, and Duran, just kind of to push back a little bit, it isn't charter. The notion of charter schools, the model of charter schools, is not particularly a bad thing. It's really based more on site-based management, which is, we could get down in the weeds, and I don't want to do that with you on this call. But it has been in Missouri, what ended up becoming charter schools was an attempt to really dismantle our public school system. And I would submit and challenge anybody to really give me a reason why I'm wrong on this, that without a robust and vibrant public education system, you can't have good charter schools. You have to have your public education system as the base. And I think that's what our superintendent in Kansas City has been attempting to help create with the coalition that he's created with some of the leading charter schools, to assure that every child who lives within the Kansas City Public School District has access to quality education opportunity. And whether that's charter school or public school or private school or parochial school, it's got to be, it's the role of the public school district to assure that every child has that opportunity. And if charter schools can be a part of that, great. But they should not be an option that is intended to replace our public school districts.
Well, and I agree with that. I want to also just add, because I promised that I would keep our discussion tonight to an hour, and we're hitting on that hour here fairly soon. I want to just end here with some lasting thoughts from the group, and we will start with Professor Jones. Any lasting thoughts here, and we'll go around and do a kind of a round table here with lasting thoughts.
Sorry, my internet is acting up. I missed the last little part of what you said.
I was just simply saying I promised to keep this to an hour, and I was just saying that I just wanted to know any lasting thoughts. We're going to just try to wrap this up, but any lasting thoughts on the conversation? And again, just wrapping this conversation up on part 2 of our critical race theory, and I wanted to start with you.
All righty. Well, for me, first of all, thank you for inviting me back. Thank you to the audience for your questions, and sorry if we didn't get to everything, but I just think it's important to keep the lines of communication open with regard to these issues, and for everyone to educate themselves, to read up on what CRT is, and to get involved in your local school community, because that's where you have the influence. And like Representative Burnett said, like Ms. Days said, it is important for parents' voices to be heard. Someone in the chat mentioned that you have this vocal minority that is driving the conversation right now. And so everyone else needs to get out there and let their voice be heard, because I think that the majority of people, most people don't know what this is. If they knew what it was, they would not feel as though it's some horrible thing. But the truth of the matter is, they do want their children to know the truth about history, which is a totally different thing. And they do want their children to be in inclusive environments and are not anti-DEI, which is also a different issue. And so we need to make sure that we separate those issues out and then get the people whose voices need to be heard, get those voices heard.
Thank you, Professor Jones. Dr. Davis.
Yes, I just will say that what we know from history is that anytime we make progress, there's always a backlash. And we are now seeing the backlash from a lot of the heightened sense of awareness around systemic racism that occurred following the death of George Floyd. And to Duran's earlier point that 9 states have already passed bills banning CRT in schools. Missouri has tried, will likely try again. I think that what this shows is that there's a very organized effort on the right to influence elections, to influence bills, and we have to be just as organized. And how do we come together to come up with actions to overturn such bills that are being presented? So I think that the NAACP has done a great job in bringing this conversation to the forefront. We now have to organize across, communities, not just Kansas City, the entire metro, parent groups, educators, concerned clergy, politicians. How are we organizing together to have a counter effort to address this before it comes back again, or else we could have a 10th state on our watch. So I would say let's not let this be the end discussion. Let's make sure that leaders on the call, that we're staying in contact and continuing this discussion with the NAACP so that we are organized to make sure that that does not happen here.
So it sounds like you want us to get Professor Jones to do a rural state tour here in Missouri to inform people about CRT.
Absolutely.
Ms. Days, final thoughts.
Yes, this discussion is a discussion that will need to be continued. Thank you so much for our local NAACP for allowing us to have 2 sessions on this topic. As we move forward, our voices need to be heard. And it's January. Our legislative body is back at work. It's time to write. It's time to pick up the phone and contact your representative and let them know how you feel about what is going on in Jefferson City. If they do not hear us and they don't know how we feel about this, and if we don't fight against it, that bill will get passed. And we will be banned teaching African-American history and anything that is truthful when it comes to race, diversity, inclusion, and equity. This is very dangerous. And this can really cripple us in education, because what we want to do is actually give our scholars the tools they need to be a good citizen in our society. And you start by teaching them the truth, and you start by teaching them about their self, their heritage, their culture, the cultures of others, that our country is a mixed bag of so many different people, and that all of us are important. And we have a responsibility to honor and respect everyone. But with this ban, you are saying, well, we can respect one group, but your message, we don't have to listen. And that's very dangerous.
And last but not least, Representative Burnett. Final
I
thought.
just, thank you so much for letting me be a part of this and having that kind of confidence in me. It's truly an honor to be of service, and anything I can do, please let me know. Please feel free to reach out to me. I also, if you're interested in my weekly newsletter, I do put out a weekly newsletter while we're in session, and you can sign up for it on ingridburnett.com. And as this will be an issue that I will be following. So anything I can do, please let me know. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Burnett. I want to again thank the panelists for taking their time to be here, to be with us, and thank the attendees to decide to be here on a Thursday night and give us an hour of their time as well. Thank you so much. And again, I want to thank our chairperson, Sandy Giles, chair of the Political Action Committee here with the NAACP, and thank the local NAACP chapter for hosting this. And thank each of you again, each of you panelists. And I know, Professor Jones, you've got another place to run, so I won't keep us. And thank you all again for joining us. Please stay warm, stay safe, and Happy New Year to all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Duran.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
Thank you. Take care.